Hey guys, welcome to AP Biology. My name is Mrs. McQuaid, and today we're going to be introducing themes that provide the foundation for understanding biology. If you'd like to print off slides to take notes on, you can visit my website at www.7gablesscience.com, then select AP Biology Unit 1. The objectives for this section include students will be able to identify common themes and big ideas studied in biology. Students will recognize that evolution, the core theme in biology, accounts for the unity and diversity of life. And students will list and describe different levels of biological organization. Most of the vocabulary from this section should be a review from previous science classes, but for some of you, that might be something you haven't seen for a year or two, so you're definitely going to want to pay close attention to these words as they come up in lecture. I suggest you pause now and write them in a notebook so that when they come up, you can write down a definition for each of them. The central activities of a biologist are to pose questions about the natural world and then try to answer those questions by applying the scientific method. Those questions could include things like, how does a single cell develop into a large multicellular organism? How does the human mind work? This opening lecture is going to set a framework for how biologists go about answering these types of questions. Biology is a subject of enormous scope, and new discoveries are being made every day. And within that scope, there are 5 unifying themes that you're going to see again and again. These include organization, information, matter and energy, interacting parts, and evolution. There are also 4 big ideas. These are, first, the process of evolution drives the diversity and unity of life. Biological systems utilize energy and molecular building blocks to grow, reproduce, and maintain dynamic homeostasis. Living systems store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information essential to life processes. And finally, biological systems interact, and these systems and their interactions possess complex properties. So throughout this lecture, we're going to be focusing on these themes and these big ideas. It doesn't take much to recognize that life is organized. Just look at the Fibonacci sequences that we can see in various life forms, from sunflowers to a snail shell, or the hurricane to a seahorse. The study of life on Earth extends from the microscopic scale of molecules and cells all the way to the global scale of the entire planet. And as biologists, we can divide this range into biological levels of organization. So let's take a look at those hierarchical levels of biological organization, and we'll start up at the top with the biosphere. The biosphere is the portion of Earth that supports life and all of the living things in it. This is going to include most regions of land and water, the atmosphere to an altitude of several kilometers, and even sediments deep in the ocean floor. Now, as we zoom in, our first scale of change is going to bring us to the ecosystem level. An ecosystem consists of all of the living things in a particular area and the non-living components in that area, including things like seasonal climate, sunlight, soil composition. Ecosystems are classified into groups called biomes, which are characterized by prevailing climate patterns and vegetation for terrestrial biomes. Think like a desert versus a tropical rainforest. If we focus in just the living things in a particular ecosystem, we're going to be looking at the community level. Communities are made up of all of the different types of species in a particular area that interact with each other. If we zoom in even more on just one particular species, we're looking at a population. Individuals of a species that are members of the same population can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Each individual within a population is an organism. An organism is just one particular living thing. Now, multicellular organisms like us are composed of organ systems, which consist of different related organs that work together to accomplish a task. For example, we have a digestive system, a nervous system, a respiratory system, an integumentary system, an immune system. The structural hierarchy of life continues to unfold as we look at individual organs that are parts of those organ systems. Organs are composed of groups of connected tissues, and they're designed to perform a specific function. So, for example, the skin is the largest organ of the body, made up of epithelial tissue. If you're a plant, a leaf would be an example of an organ designed to capture the energy in sunlight. Tissues make up organs, and tissues are groups of cells that work together to perform specialized functions. In animals, there are 4 categories of tissue, including nervous, epithelial, connective, and muscle. We'll revisit those later in the year. So tissues are made of cells, and each cell is the fundamental unit of structure and function in living things. Some organisms are only one cell big, like amoebas or bacteria, and others, like us, are composed of trillions of cells. In eukaryotes, we see compartments in cells called organelles. Organelle literally means tiny organ, and each of them carries out a series of chemical reactions important for cellular metabolism. Finally, cells and organelles are made up of organic molecules, and there are 4 major categories of organic molecules: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. The most common elements that make up these elements or molecules are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Zooming in under finer and finer resolution illustrates a principle that we call reductionism. This is an approach that reduces complex systems to simpler, more manageable components. And while it's a powerful tool, we lose sight of the forest for the trees, as they say. When we zoom out, we see novel properties emerge at each level that were absent from the preceding one. These are called emergent properties. So emergent properties result from the arrangement and interacting parts within a system. For example, if you think about chloroplast in a leaf cell, it's able to do photosynthesis, but if you take all of the components of the chloroplast, all of the molecules, the chlorophyll, mix it up in a test tube, they don't do photosynthesis anymore. They have to be organized just right. It's kind of like thinking about a car. If I gave you all the parts of a car in a big bag, you wouldn't get anywhere very far. Those pieces have to be assembled properly in order for the car to run. So that functionality that we see at each higher level of organization is what we call an emergent property. At each level of biological organization, we find a correlation between structure and function. So, for example, that leaf, the organ of the plant that we talked about earlier, its thin, flat shape increases surface area for maximum sunlight capture by the chloroplasts. That allows the plant to get energy better. A hummingbird's wing allows for rotation at the shoulder, and that actually allows the birds to not just hover, but even fly backwards, and that, of course, facilitates their ability to get nectar from a plant. A neuron, you can see down here, this is a nerve, a nerve cell, and these are designed with this unique shape that other cell types don't have. So they've got these antennae that we call dendrites that can receive information, and then they have these long tails called axons that can transmit that information to another part of the body. And even things like the fact that birds have hollow bones, which makes them lighter so that they can fly. So it doesn't matter what level of organization we look at, molecules, cells, entire organisms, Structure always determines function. The cell is the smallest unit of organization that can perform all of the activities required for life. All cells share certain characteristics, like being enclosed in a membrane, which we call a phospholipid bilayer, and that regulates what enters and leaves the cell. They also have ribosomes that build their proteins, and they have DNA to store their genetic information. But from here, we can distinguish two major categories of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes, as you can see up here, are much smaller than eukaryotes. They're generally simpler in structure, and they lack internal membrane-bound compartments that we talked about earlier called organelles. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, do have membrane-enclosed organelles, each of which has a unique structure and function that it uses to carry out specific metabolic activities within the cell. The hallmark, of course, of the eukaryote is the presence of the nucleus, which here is this kind of big purple thing that stores the DNA. Our next theme revolves around information. Within cells, structures called chromosomes contain genetic information in the form of DNA, also known as deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA undergoes a process of supercoiling and packaging during the process of cell division that makes chromosomes visible, and you can see them in the image below, highlighted in blue. The number of chromosomes is unique to each species, and each chromosome contains one very long piece of DNA consisting of hundreds or thousands of genes. A gene is a section of DNA that contains instructions for building proteins and so codes for a trait. Each gene is a discrete unit of inheritance that allows an organism to build any one of its many traits. Genes are transmitted from parents to offspring via chromosomes carried by the egg and sperm. When a sperm fertilizes an egg, it forms a zygote that contains all of the instructions to direct growth and development of a new individual. Genes encode the information necessary to build all of the molecules synthesized within the cell, which in turn establishes a cell's identity and its function. So as DNA is replicated and passed on to daughter cells through mitosis and cell division, cells can begin to differentiate under the direction of the DNA, depending on which proteins they produce. And that process of division and differentiation is what's going to direct your development and over the course of 9 months turn you from a cell or ball of cells into a baby. It's the molecular structure of DNA that accounts for its ability to store information. Each DNA molecule is made up of 2 long strands arranged into a double helix. Each strand has 4 different types of chemical building blocks called nucleotides. These include adenine, or A, thymine, or T, cytosine, or C, and guanine, G. It's the arrangement of these nucleotides within genes that encode information. For example, consider the words rat, tar, and art. They're all made with the same letters, but the arrangement is different, giving different meanings to the words. So the way we arrange the A's and T's and C's and G's allow our genes to produce different protein products. The sequence of each gene provides a blueprint for building a protein, and proteins are major players in building the cell and carrying out its activities. Now, in science, when you see images like this, they're not just pictures for you to kind of blow past. It's really important that you learn to use these models. So this is a model of gene expression, and what I want you to do is pause the video, and in a notebook or on some loose leaf paper, I want you to first identify the components that you see within this model that are needed for gene expression. Then identify the location of transcription and translation, and tell me what the building blocks are that proteins are made out of. Okay, did you do it? You should have said the components needed for gene expression are DNA, which we can see here, messenger RNA, mRNA, which we see here, ribosomes, and amino acids. You should have identified the location of transcription as inside the nucleus, since that is where your DNA is being transcribed into messenger RNA. And the location of translation is out here in the cytoplasm, since that is where you are building your protein. Finally, you should have seen that it is amino acids. These little guys here are being put together to build your polypeptide chain or your protein chain. The sequence of genes in the DNA gets transcribed into messenger RNA, which then gets translated into a chain of protein building blocks called amino acids. Once completed, the amino acid chain will fold up into a unique shape and carry out a specific function in the body. So this entire process that we see here, we call that gene expression, going from DNA to RNA to protein. Now, the entire library of genetic instructions that an organism inherits is called a genome. Entire genome sequence of many species have already been determined, and to make sense of this deluge of information, scientists are applying what we call systems biology approach. That means instead of studying individual genes, we look at entire sets of genes, and that process is called genomics. So when we look at sets of genes, we can study the interactions between the genes and more complex phenotypes within organisms. Likewise, there's a term called proteomics, which refers to the study of collections of proteins and their properties. So just like you have a genome, which is your entire collection of genes in a particular cell or organism, you also have a proteome, which is the entire collection of proteins expressed by a given cell or group of cells. And genomics and proteomics together generate so much data that it would be impossible to analyze without the help of bioinformatics. Bioinformatics refers to the use of computational tools to store, organize, and analyze huge volumes of data. And it's kind of a booming field in biology right now. So if you are a person who enjoys working on computers, with computer programs and doing calculations, maybe that is a career for you. All right, our next theme is about matter and energy. So moving, growing, reproducing, and the various cellular activities of life are all types of work, and all types of work require energy. Now, the input of energy occurs primarily from the sun. So sunlight energy enters an ecosystem, and plants, through the process of photosynthesis, can convert that to chemical energy. And then animals, of course, can eat the plants and convert that chemical energy to, say, the mechanical energy of movement. Okay. So chemical energy in food molecules generated in photosynthesis get passed through food chains from producers to consumers. And each time that energy is passed on, some of it can be used by the organism to maintain homeostasis, but most of it, like 90%, is actually lost to the environment in the form of heat. So energy moves through ecosystems in a one-way path. It enters as light, it gets converted to chemical energy, maybe mechanical energy, and then lost as heat. Matter, on the other hand, gets recycled between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So chemicals like carbon dioxide and water that we can see here going into a plant, specifically the chloroplast, which would be found in a leaf, through a series of chemical reactions, those get converted into sugars and oxygen. And then animals might eat the plant, or, this is very important, plants as well as animals, can do this process of cellular respiration. And that's where the energy that's stored in those sugar molecules is broken down and used to generate a molecule that we see down here called ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it drives cellular work for all living things on the planet. ATP is the most important energy molecule. It doesn't matter if you are an E. coli bacteria or a fox. We all use ATP. So matter can be recycled because then through the process of cellular respiration, we will convert the sugar and the oxygen back into water and carbon dioxide, and that can re-enter this cycle. And of course, at the point that any of these organisms die, decomposition will take place, and those materials get returned to the environment where they can be reused over and over and over again. And so a kind of big idea or part of this theme isn't just matter and energy, it's also interacting systems, because while we rely on our environment to provide these materials and the energy that we need to maintain homeostasis and survive, we also have an impact on the environment. For example, before the evolution of photosynthetic organisms, there was no free oxygen in the atmosphere. So really, on a global scale, plants and other photosynthetic organisms have generated all of the oxygen that we need, that terrestrial life relies on to survive. Okay. Now, part of this big idea or theme is that we use that energy to maintain dynamic homeostasis. And the word dynamic means constantly changing, and the word homeostasis means to keep stable. So when we talk about dynamic homeostasis, we're talking about the changes that our bodies need to make all the time to keep our internal environment stable. So, for example, we know that we need to keep our body temperature at 98.6 degrees if you're a human, right? And sometimes the way we keep our body temperature at 98.6 is when we're cold, we shiver, and that generates heat to warm us up. And other times, like, now, for example, when it's warm outside, we don't shiver to keep ourselves at 98.6. We sweat because it's hot out. And so that gets to that dynamic part, that ability to change and respond to our environment to keep a stable internal state. So we use what are known as feedback mechanisms to regulate biological systems and dynamic homeostasis. Negative feedback means that as more of a product accumulates, the process that creates it slows down and less of the product is produced. Positive feedback means that as more of a product accumulates, the process that creates it speeds up and more of the product is produced. So let me give you some examples. We'll look at a negative feedback loop. So here is a reactant, and this is something that we want to turn into something else, right? So the way we convert reactants into products is through chemical reactions, and usually that requires an enzyme. So we'll say reactant 1 is acted on by enzyme 1, and that forms an intermediate product. And many of our metabolic processes are multi-step pathways. So we're going to look at a two-step pathway here. Okay, so we'll say we need to do another set of chemical reactions, and so we have a different enzyme to do that, and that creates a final product for us. That final product, though, can go back and interact with possibly reactant 1 and bind to it, and that prevents it from undergoing that first chemical reaction. So what this does is it allows us to make enough of the final product that we need but not more than we need, because if we make more than we need, we're wasting energy. Now, this is one way to turn the process down, but it's worth mentioning that there are other ways as well. So instead of shutting down the reactant, your final product might also act on that enzyme and prevent the enzyme from converting reactant 1 into your intermediate product, or it could prevent enzyme 2. It really can happen at any step of the process, but that's an example of a negative feedback loop where you have your final product, once it accumulates in enough concentration, can go shut down the process that creates it. Here's an example of a model that is commonly used, and you want to pay attention to these models. Like I said, they're really important that you understand what they mean. So you can see you've got A, B, C, and D, with D being your product, A being your first reactant, and then your B and C kind of being your intermediate products, right? They're just steps along the way. You can see that there are enzymes responsible for catalyzing the different steps of the chemical reactions. And then you can see here, they're using this red arrow with a negative sign here to show you that your product, D, can go and shut this down. And usually when it points at the arrow like that, it's because it's going to interact with the enzyme. Like I said, it could also interact with your reactant or any of the enzymes, but this is just one example of how you would read a model like that. Now, positive feedback loops, remember, these are things that are going to enhance the production of the product. So in this example, we have a stimulus, which is suckling. So there are receptors in the skin of the nipple that detect suckling and send a message to the hypothalamus, which of course is in the brain. And the hypothalamus can send a message to the posterior pituitary, causing it to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone, and so it'll enter the bloodstream and travel to the mammary glands and stimulate the ejection of more milk. And obviously, if there's more milk, then there will be more nursing, and that will reinforce the stimulus so that the process continues. Here's an example of what these positive feedback loops can look like when you're looking at a simple model. So again, here we've got reactant W, we've got two intermediate products, X and Y, and our final product that we're trying to get to is Z. And here you can see Z is going and somehow interacting. You can see we've got a green arrow with a positive sign. It's going to go interact probably, it looks like, with enzyme 5. And often that interaction kind of like supercharges it or turbocharges it. It kicks it into high gear so that really starts pumping out your intermediate product Y, and so you can get more of your final product Z. All right, so our next theme is that organisms interact with different parts of our environment. And we already saw that a little bit when we looked at the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and especially how photosynthesis puts oxygen into the environment. But it's worth noting that every single organism interacts with its environment, including the living and non-living factors, and that includes us, humans. And unfortunately, our interactions sometimes have pretty dire consequences. So, for example, over the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, humans have really increased the amount of fossil fuels that we burn, coal, oil, and gas. And we know that that practice releases large amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. About half of that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, acting like a blanket and causing heat to get trapped close to Earth's surface. At the same time that we are creating carbon dioxide and trapping heat near Earth's surface, we're also clear-cutting forests or burning them down, either to make space for farmland and agriculture, or to harvest the trees for paper products and other materials that we make. Plants are the only thing that naturally removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So when we remove plants from the area to make room for cities or farms or whatever, it means that not only are we putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but at the same time, we're reducing the planet's natural abilities to remove that carbon dioxide. So scientists have calculated that carbon dioxide released by human activities have caused an average global temperature of the planet to increase by 1 degree since 1900, and they predict another 3 degrees of increase before the end of the century. That ongoing global warming is a major aspect of climate change. Now, climate and weather are different, don't confuse them. Climate change refers to a directional change in the global climate that lasts 3 decades or longer. That's very different than weather, which looks at short-term changes in temperature or precipitation. So we frequently will see, like, for example, a couple of years ago, we had that polar vortex in the winter, and people were like, global warming's a hoax because it's -30 out. Well, no, you're talking about the weather. When we talk about global warming and climate change, we're talking about kind of multi-year, decades-long changes in climate. And it's not just temperature, it's not just global warming. Wind and precipitation patterns have also been shifting, and we've seen extreme weather events like storms and droughts that happen more intensely and more often. And unfortunately, as organisms struggle to survive in their very quickly changing environments, many of them are becoming endangered, and some have already gone extinct. And we are organisms that are totally dependent on this planet for our survival. So there is always a possibility that we can alter the planet so much we make it uninhabitable even for humanity. And that, of course, is a worst case scenario. I tend to be hopeful, and I think that there are things we could do to mitigate some of the things, the impacts that we're having on the planet, but it's going to require funding and a real effort on the part of individual people to make that happen. So we have a whole unit on this, and we will talk definitely a lot more about that later in the year. All right, our final theme, evolution. So having looked at the 4 unifying themes, we're going to dive into the core theme of biology now, which is evolution. And this is the core theme because it makes sense of everything we know about organisms. The fossil record shows that life has been evolving on Earth for billions of years, resulting in vast diversity of plants, of past and present organisms. But along with diversity, we see unity. So, for example, if you look at the forearm of these animals I have here, you can see the same pattern in each different species. So pterodactyl, dolphin, dog, human, shrew, sheep, seal, bat. It doesn't matter which one you look at. You're going to see one large bone depicted in orange, connected to 2 skinnier bones, connected to a bunch of small bones. The pattern is the same. Even though we see the same number of bones connected in the same pattern, though, the corresponding bones between the different species is different in length or thickness or a little bit of shape even, and that's because of the selection pressures imparted by the environments they live in, right? So an appendage that has been modified for flight is going to be different than an appendage that has been modified for grasping or running or swimming. Now, diversity is a hallmark of life. Biologists have identified about 1.8 million species of organisms, but we actually estimate that the number of actual species is somewhere between 10 and 100 million. And these remarkably diverse forms arose through evolutionary processes that we're going to look at in just a minute. Before we dive into the processes, let's look at how we organize and categorize the enormous variety of life into meaningful groups. So biologists have long used careful comparisons of form and function to classify life forms into a hierarchy of increasingly inclusive groups. In the last few decades, new methods of assessing species relationships, especially comparisons of DNA sequences, have led to reevaluations of larger groups. Taxonomy is the branch of biology that names and classifies species into groups of increasing breadth. So probably you know every organism will be put into a unique genus and species name. So for example, humans are Homo sapien. And using DNA evidence, we have come up with the three largest groups, the three most inclusive groups. We call them domains of life. So the three highest levels of classification are called domains, and they include eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. The organisms that make up two of the domains, bacteria and archaea, are prokaryotic. So if you remember what we said earlier, prokaryotes, they are single-celled, they are smaller, less complex, and they lack membrane-bound organelles. The third group of organisms are called eukarya, and they have eukaryotic cells. So this domain is going to include three kingdoms of multicellular eukaryotes: plants, fungi, and animals, each distinguished partly by their modes of nutrition. So plants, we know, can produce their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Animals you should be pretty familiar with since you are one. We ingest and then digest our food. And fungi are a little bit different. So they are not producers like plants. People commonly mistake mushrooms as plants, and they're not. They actually use a process of external digestion and then absorb the dissolved nutrients from their surroundings. So those three groups are kind of categorized based on modes of nutrition. Now, the most numerous and diverse of eukaryotes are the single-celled protists, and although they were once placed into a single kingdom, they are now often classified into several groups, and a major reason for that change is that using DNA evidence, we can see that some protists are actually less closely related to other protists than they are to plants, animals, or fungi. So some protists are more closely related to a plant. For example, seaweed. Lots of people think seaweed is a plant. It's not, it's a protist. It is very closely related to plants though, right? And so we kind of are now developing new groups for protists. All right, so now that we know about the branches of taxonomy and how we classify organisms, let's go and look at this process of evolution. Okay. So while diversity is apparent when we look at the variety of life on the planet, there's also remarkable unity. Consider the fact that every single living thing on the planet uses the same genetic language written in the DNA molecule. In fact, similarities between organisms are found at every level of biological hierarchy, and it was Darwin's theory of evolution through the process of natural selection that helped us understand that many differences and the similarities that we see in life. So in 1859, Charles Darwin published one of the most important and influential books of the time called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. His book articulated two main points. The first was that species arise from a succession of ancestors that were different from them. He called this process descent with modification. And if you think about it, this one phrase really begins to capture the duality of life's unity and diversity. So there's unity in our kinship among species that descended from common ancestors. And then the diversity occurs in the modifications that evolve as species branch from those common ancestors and become modified to live in different environments. His second point was his proposal of natural selection as the primary cause of the descent with modification. he observed that individuals in a population tend to vary in their traits, and many of those traits are heritable. So if you think people, eye color, hair color, height, the shape of your nose, whatever. He also observed that more offspring are often produced than can survive. So that immediately creates competition among them. And finally, he said that species generally suit their environment, and that's because those differences in the population are going to make some of their members better at survival and reproduction than other members. So when they compete, there's often a winner and a loser. And if the loser ends up dead, dead things don't reproduce. And because traits are heritable, their traits don't get passed on to the next generation. Darwin inferred that individuals that are best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce because when you reproduce, you pass your traits to the next generation. Over many generations, more individuals in a population are going to have those advantageous traits. So evolution occurs as the unequal reproductive success of individuals. In other words, the environment selects for the propagation of beneficial traits, and that process is what Darwin calls natural selection. So we can look at an example of how natural selection works. Let's say there's a group of beetles living in a particular environment that has just experienced a brush fire. The fire chars many of the plants and blackens the soil, so everything is much darker than it used to be. Now, the survivors of the beetle population varied extensively in their inherited colors, so that you can see that they range from very light to very dark. But because their environment changed, they're not equally well suited because as predators like this hungry bird come in looking for food, it's obviously much easier to spot the lighter colored beetle more easily and eat them. And once they're eaten, obviously they're removed from the population, and it's not just them that's removed. Their genetics goes with them. The gene that codes for the lighter colored trait is gone too. So over time and over generations, that gene for that lighter colored trait becomes less and less common in the population, and it could actually disappear entirely. So our definition of evolution for this class is going to be a change in the genetic makeup of populations over many generations. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out about this definition. It's really important when you talk about evolution, when you define evolution, that you talk about not just the trait, but the genetic makeup of the population. And that's easy to do if you remember that traits, of course, are encoded for by genes. But the other really important thing you want to do is use the word generation, not time. I can't tell you how many people on the AP Bio exams lose points because they say over time. The problem with the word time is it's really kind of ambiguous. A long time for a fruit fly is like 2 days, right? But a long time for a human is, however, I don't know, 20, 30 years before we reproduce our next generation usually. So time is not a good word. Evolution always occurs over generations, all right? Okay, moving on. So Darwin proposed that natural selection could cause an ancestral species to actually give rise to 2 or more descendant species that are totally brand new, different species than their ancestors. So, for example, Darwin famously studied finches on the Galapagos Islands, and we can see that all of these finches depicted on the right are very similar, with main differences being in their beak size and shape. So you should think of adaptations like beaks as a tool that an organism uses to survive, in this case, to acquire food, right? And so some beaks are better at eating small insects. Other beaks that are bigger are going to be able to crack open seeds or maybe eat certain kinds of fruits. So Each beak has been selected for by the environment, specifically by whatever available food source there is in the environment that they were found in. These evolutionary relationships are often illustrated with these tree-like diagrams called sometimes cladograms or phylogenetic trees. We'll get more into the differences between those at the end of the year. We have a whole unit on evolution. But it's important to note that each branch point here represents the divergence of two different evolutionary lineages from a common ancestor. So branch points occur when two or more coexisting populations no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring. And there's a variety of reasons that could occur that we'll look at again later in the year. But for now, I think probably we have covered enough for one day. So thanks for watching. For more resources, including printable notes, worksheets, links to online practice, visit my website at www.sevengablescience.com, and feel free to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Seven Gables Science, to keep learning. Thanks, guys.